Is my water anywhere near?
Go ahead, Mo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mo Salemy, and I would like to invite you to the conversation we organized as part of the Fixing the Future platform. This conversation in particular is between Anthony Paul Smith and Peter Wolfendale. They'll be speaking about the possibilities and the limitations of the reemergence of universalism as a philosophical concept, both in the field of thought and politics. And I've asked Deneb to moderate, and each person probably will do a proper introduction of themselves. Deneb will be moderating the conversation between Peter and Paul. And just as a little reference, I would like to say that the urgency of this conversation came out of the two separate threads of conversation that were going on social media, on Google Plus and on Facebook, about the statement put out by Summer School in Berlin, signed by Armen Avanesian, Reza Negarestani, and Peter Wolfendale. But I felt that the responses in Google Hangout and Facebook were dealing with a much larger issue rather than just what the Summer School in Berlin was trying to do. So I kind of brainstormed with my colleagues in Fixing the Future, Sohail Malik, Keith Tilford, and Joshua Johnson, and we decided to somehow host this event and sort of like bring those larger concerns, which we kind of like thought is basically universalism, to the table and get people on both sides of this debate, sort of like who've been taking on the role of talking about this, to kind of like get into a conversation and ask Deneb to kind of like moderate it. So that was my part, and I would like to just like ask Deneb to take over from here and sort of like lead the discussion, and let's see where it goes. Thanks for joining us, and I also want to thank Jason Adams and GCast for helping with the technical aspects of this with us. And he's in the background there, sort of like making sure that this doesn't crash or doesn't go wrong, and just like an Incredible Machines conference. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, my name is Deneb. I'm pursuing a PhD at Columbia University. I'm in the Latin American and Iberian Cultures department, and also doing a certificate at the Comparative Literature and Society Institute. My research basically deals with epistemic regimes that emerged in the Amazon in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I'm interested in sciences, fiction and nonfiction emerging out of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia around the period of the rubber boom cycle. So just that's who I am. And I'm also participating in the summer school in Berlin, presenting more or less on this topic and more broadly on the question of the transition from colonialism to post-colonialism. So I'm gonna start just with just a context or contextualization of the debate that I have prepared, I think, just to clear some things up before we start. I'll read this out, and then I think we can move to Pete's introduction and to Anthony's. So to situate today's conversation under a new light, rather than relying on what public knowledge is about each position or simply importing them, I thought it would be best to start with some preliminary remarks and even attempt a couple of definitions that we could use as points of departure for the proposed discussion of universalism and its discontents. So we see today a striking pattern in how contemporary theories attempt to establish themselves as general protocols by laying claim to contested terms. Words such as modernity, capitalism, rationalism, universalism, colonialism, and even philosophy itself are given concrete and specific meanings by the rational and discursive contexts within which they're more or less systematically deployed. This results in a proliferation of logocentrisms, whose clashing engenders contestations, disputes, misunderstandings around what constitutes and qualifies as a politically engaged and intellectually coherent, if not valuable or novel position. While the proliferation of such productions could be taken as indication of a prolific moment in philosophical and political thought, there's an extent to which the possibility of actual encounters among these differing positions seems to have ironically become all the more complicated. The proliferation of logocentrism also results in the rehearsal of public demands for explanation, clarification, and demonstrations of intellectual coherence. Given such configuration, it seems that conversations take place thanks to the predominance of common sense as a regulating principle between parties, representatives, and affiliates of ideas, where the a priori yet often disavowed agreement and commitment to terms, projects, and positions make the development and fortifications of logocentrism possible. So whether one sees the retrieval and reconceptualization of universalism as problematic or desirable, the truth is that the very demand of intellectual coherence and public self-explanation is also historically a product of the Enlightenment and of the advent of public reason. In other words, one can disagree with what is understood as containing and carrying forth the content of a so-called Enlightenment project, while at the same time rely on a social-intellectual mode of interaction that was highly commended and adopted by the same Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers. In a similar vein, while social networks and other channels of communication, such as the one we find ourselves today, make the differences between theories and political positions publicly evident, it is not the case that we have done away with common sense, since the agreement to disagree simply reiterates the multiculturalist, the relativist, and the neoliberal proliferation of mutually incommensurable perspectives. So since a lot of what passes as post-colonial thought, which would seem to be the main critique of universalism and colonialism in Western thought, is actually fostered through the multiculturalist values I'm trying to outline, I think it's important then to just briefly say three main tendencies in the scholarly treatment of colonialism, which we can take up and engage with them or reject or say something different. But this is more or less a very kind of summarized outline of three main tendencies in the treatment of colonialism. The one would be that material objects, lives, histories, realities, and the conditions of a previously colonized space, such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, you name. But I could mainly speak in terms of the Latin American context, are not to be seen merely as objects of study. Much of what people think of as post-colonial theory, in fact, merely engages with the realities of colonialism as something to be studied. This tendency is particularly prevalent in Northern Hemisphere, especially Anglo-American cultural studies. And you can see that in gender and race studies. And what you see is merely, the ways in which, how you can give structure to a reality that is alien, but at the same time needs to be converted into an object of study so that the colonial history can be properly placed in its background. A second one would be that, this is to say that even though an engagement with the realities of post-coloniality is paramount, simply articulating the content by affiliating oneself with some non-representative of post-colonial theory does not necessarily amount to a post-colonial position or attitude, because this key feature of the colonial perspective is retained. Namely, the subject surveys an object, and the epistemological valence of this exchange is maintained or privileged towards the side of the one who is studying rather than being studied. This is how common sense and colonial logocentrism masquerades as universalism. A third one would be an interperspectival engagement, and that would be pretty much one of the few alternatives we have to this common sense paradigm of objectivity. The post-colonial perspective can only be taken as an interlocutor rather than as an object on the basis of an understanding of the epistemic conditions that give rise to thought within a colonized horizon. So in order to acknowledge emancipation from colonization, one also has to participate in it. One has to make that a positive project. This is to say that rather than articulate one's perspective and express its sense as to make it understood by others who are already capable of agreeing to disagree, a properly post-colonial position would be one in which you see the other as an agent of his or her own thought rather than merely an object of your study. So these are the three main threads that I wanted to outline, and just to close off, I would move to a question that I think is paramount in the debates that have been going on around the question of universalism, which is the question of whether modernity, capitalism, and coloniality can and should be disentangled. Because on the one hand, to affirm their equivalence, their interchangeability, as in, well, the history of modernity is the history of colonialism, risks the determinism of histories that merely see post-colonial reality, such as Latin America, as a continuation and the product of the past, failing to affirm the fact that novel epistemic, social, and cultural conditions have indeed been created, a position that takes for granted and as automatic its own post-coloniality. On the other hand, the difficult task of intensifying the conceptual disentanglement of modernity, colonialism, and capitalism, as in the case of new rationalisms and accelerationism, propose a new conception of reason and universality, must also wrestle with the articulation of how it can engage with the legacy of colonialism and with thinkers of the Southern Hemisphere as agents of thought in a way that is true to the encounter with epistemic alterity, and specifically and especially how that alterity functions within the universalist paradigm. So that would mean how, the question would be, how would that actually have something to say, and how would that actually have an import in the universalist paradigm? This is pretty much the context I wanted to outline before moving to you, Anthony, and to Pete.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So I understand our task here to, well, I should say I'm Anthony Paul Smith. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religion at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, and I work in the area of philosophy and religion, basically. So I understand our task here to be that of analyzing the relationship between universalism as represented in the Accelerate Manifesto, and a bit more obliquely but tellingly in the blurb for the summer school that's happening soon. I want to at least mention at the outset. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback from Joshua.
If Jason can put Joshua's microphone on mute, that would be lovely.
Thanks. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so I want to at least mention at the outset that there are aspects of the emerging school I agree with. It's very clear that new struggles have emerged as a result of new organizations of capital, which occurred as a response to new forms of production, etc. And I know the polite thing to do is to praise everyone willing to confront these new struggles and being bold in their new thinking, and that the implication is one ought to stand up and build with this movement. Yet there is a kind of brand building at play operating through distinguishing this project from that project. The editorial introduction to the Accelerate reader is telling in that regard, as is the remarks in the manifesto, criticizing in very harsh terms most actually existing movements, the famous and I think problematic folk politics designation. And that makes dialogue, I think, somewhat difficult as it seems to involve conversion. But I agree we must respond to these new struggles, and I agree with the focus on climate change, the call for a universal basic income, the idea that productive sites and infrastructures of late capitalism are, as Alberto Toscano has also argued, potentially reconfigurable, and that we need not fear technology, that localism is not going to provide the strategy for dealing with the necropolitics of capitalism. We agree on a number of these things, and even where we disagree, I think it is a matter of talking through problems of strategy and tactics. But I'm going to leave aside here those caveats for time's sake. So you might be asking, especially those who follow the id that is my Twitter stream, so what's your fucking problem then with accelerationism? Let me state the thesis as clearly as I can, and clarity, I think, will require here a kind of polemic, but not a personal one. This isn't about the intentions of those involved in accelerationism. Accelerationist politics will not be emancipatory, but a repetition of the colonial project in the realm of theory and practice, as long as it does not deal with the middle passage, with the ways in which the initial accelerating power of capitalism was built precisely through the subjugation and destruction of the black slave, which persists after the formal end of slavery. And so it becomes necessary to ask, as Daniel Colucciello-Barber did on Facebook today, can rationalist commitment to the resurrection of universalism be separated from commitment to the resurrection of Christianity? What is the relation between the claim that we must reconceive emancipation in navigational terms and the navigation of the Middle Passage? What is the relationship between movement from the space of reasons to the space of freedoms and the space of the slave ship? Okay. So where Cernick and Williams say in a Gramscian vein, I'm going to quote from the Manifesto here, to generate a new left, global hegemony sorry, my computer's throwing something at me here. Global hegemony entails a recovery of lost possible futures, and indeed the recovery of the future as such. To that, we ask, this is me now, whither the slave in the future as such? Frank B. Wilderson III, in his Gramsci's Black Marx, Whither the Slave in Civil Society, argues that, and I'm quoting from Wilderson here, the scandal with which the black subject position threatens Gramscian discourse is manifest in the subject's ontological disarticulation of Gramscian categories: work, progress, production, exploitation, hegemony, and historical self-awareness. He then goes on to lay out a number of unsettling consequences, of which I will only quote the first two. Quote, first, the black subject imposes a radical incoherence upon the assumptive logic of Gramscian discourse. In other words, she or he implies a scandal. Secondly, the black subject reveals Marxism's inability to think white supremacy as the base, and in so doing calls into question Marxism's claims to elaborate a comprehensive, or in the words of Antonio Gramsci, decisive antagonism. Stated another way, Gramscian Marxism is able to imagine the subject what transforms her or himself into a mass of antagonistic identity formations which can precipitate a crisis in wage slavery, exploitation, and or hegemony. But it is asleep at the wheel when asked to provide enabling antagonisms towards unwaged slavery, despotism, and or terror. Now, of course, the Manifesto plays lip service to the colonial system at the root of, and the corollary structures of sexism and racism and capitalism. But what it fails to do, I think, is actually think accelerationism according to the fundamental antagonism manifest in the black slave. It still wants to set itself up as the universally applicable form of leftist politics, and that lip service breaks down very clearly in the description of the summer school. I'm going to read from that description now, and if we want to talk about this in the Q&A, I think we should and we can, but frankly I think these lines are very telling, and I quote, "Not only does this postmodern inflection of emancipation sever its negative moment, freedom from its positive moment, freedom to, it jettisons the theoretical resources needed to make sense of this distinction. Afraid of reactivating the worst aspects of Enlightenment universalism, colonialism, it systematically refuses any unified concept of freedom, preferring to map disparate if intersecting forms of oppression, post-colonialism. There is nothing wrong with this cartography of injustice, but the lived experience of oppression that it refuses to rise above provides us with no practical orientation within the space of possibilities and constrains as it describes. There is no corresponding concept of justice and thus no emancipatory vector. Though this antipathy to and perhaps fear of the positive content of modernity is principally political, it has colonized the intellectual and artistic domains, coalescing into a pervasive cultural negativity that more often obstructs than enacts emancipation. Far from being the culmination of Enlightenment egalitarianisms, these liberalisms are defined by the same perverse refusal to conceptualize liberty as their erstwhile opponents." Unquote. So rather than the earlier lip service or this pathologizing, you post-colonialists are the real colonizers perspective, what I think is needed is a rethinking of the very notion and value of universalism itself, without slipping into some valoration of localism, but also without necessarily a reference to localism. That's this kind of setting up is, you know, if you're either this kind of universalist or you're a localist, I think that's problematic. as well as saying that you're either this or a liberal pseudo-multiculturalist. What is demanded is not patronizing the subaltern, but actually considering that the language you speak about liberty is not something translatable without analogy into their actual emancipation. Towards its conclusion, the Manifesto makes this claim: towards a time of collective self-mastery and the properly alien future that entails and enables, towards the completion of the Enlightenment project of self-criticism and self-mastery rather than its elimination. Now, some have argued that we can eliminate the racist project from the Enlightenment project, that the abstract universalism declared as part of Enlightenment, that this abstract universal may be separated or distinguished from its historical expression as the creation of the black race and then the destruction of the black bodies in the pursuit of the accumulation of wealth. I find such a separation dubious, and the call for it simply a protection of the unified identity of Enlightenment, which includes its, quote-unquote, bad parts. There is no true Enlightenment behind its historical expression. It is how it is historically, for good and ill. Here's a major contradiction in the Manifesto. For on the one hand, we are called towards a properly alien future, but that alien future is precisely the recovery of a European future. One could be forgiven for thinking that this alien future is perhaps only alien to the indigenous who, rather than the Bible, may be given Smith's Wealth of Nations and Marx's Capital and told one must make sacrifices for the future. Why not think a truly alien future, one utterly alien, not to various Anglo-European debates about postmodernism in science, and declare its alienness through an identification to what is frankly most familiar to those debates, Prometheus. So why don't we declare something so utterly alien instead to the world, which is always an Amero-European world that, again, as Wilderson argues, the slave is not a part of except as living death. So it seems to me, and I'm going to close my remarks here, that the choice given in the Manifesto is too stark. But I think ultimately it points to the truth of a very bleak future. Responding to that crisis should not simply pay lip service to the invisible structural necessity of the slave in the development of capitalism, that necessary springboard, we're told, for the future, but to think the entire project of a global post-capitalism from that very antagonism. Everything else will simply be the worldling of the slave, a repetition of colonial gestures. And I want to end with a quote from Talal Asad that I think lays out kind of the trap, kind of the danger here. A bad conscience is no bar to further immoral action. It merely gives such action a distinctive style. All right, thank you. I think Pete's muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Right, well, everybody else seems to be muted, so I'm just going to talk. Right, okay. I have a number of things to say. The first thing I'm going to say is I wrote the summer school intro pretty much entirely, so anything that's in there is entirely my fault. Particularly the choice of the word colonized at one point. So where it says, though this antipathy to and perhaps fear of the positive content of modernity is principally political, it has colonized the intellectual and artistic domains. That I admit is just a slippage on my part. I shouldn't have used that word. If anyone wants to psychoanalyze me on the basis of that, feel free. But I genuinely believe that there is no importance to that word beyond my own personal psychology. There's the idea that the summer school is somehow oriented around the idea that it's post-colonial theorists who are the real colonizers is just wrong. That's not the idea. The idea rather is that there are certain appropriations of post-colonial ideas alongside postmodernist ideas and other forms of kind of reactionary anti-modernism that fundamentally prevent political and intellectual progress, and well, even artistic progress. But that's a whole other dimension. Now, getting on to what I want to actually talk about, I've got a quote as well, and this is from Dipesh Chakrabarty's dialogue with Amitav Ghosh. This is a little bit cherry picking, but I just thought it was a perfect quote. He says in response to Ghosh, "To acknowledge our debt to the ideas of enlightenment is not to thank colonialism for bringing them to us." And I think this is a fantastic statement on Chakrabarty's part, and it has to be respected. I.e., his ability to acknowledge certain Enlightenment ideals in the very process of critiquing the Enlightenment has to be maintained. And what Anthony was saying about the idea that the separation of like aspects of the Enlightenment internal to modernity and whatnot from, you know, colonialism or capitalism or patriarchy or whatever kind of structural forms of oppression you want to talk about, the idea that you can only just take those things as a unitary monolith doesn't respect this. It makes it completely impossible to actually use the intellectual resources of the tradition we find ourselves in to critique that tradition. Now, Dan Barber, in his discussion with Anthony on his podcast, put the point Anthony was making about the middle way in slavery in terms of theodicy. So he said that that accelerationism in affirming modernity somehow has to thereby affirm the slave trade. They have to affirm like the suffering of the slaves as the condition that got us to where we are. And I just think that this is completely false. If we have to affirm every causal condition leading to the position we find ourselves in today, then in order to affirm any of the positive conditions for emancipation we find within that position, right, then politics is just impossible. Like this completely and utterly eradicates the possibility of any kind of emancipatory theoretical engagement with the present, right? We have to be able to engage with the past in such a way as to bring out the bits that we think are positive and progressive in order to separate them from and critique the bits that we think are unjust and oppressive. I'll return to this shortly if I have time. What I'd like to do is to switch to kind of explaining a little bit about this sort of nexus of rationalism and accelerationism that we're kind of discussing here, because we're definitely talking about, as Deneb Moore made clear, on the one hand a kind of intellectual nexus, and on the other hand a political nexus. So first of all, we can talk about rationalism and rationalist universalism, and this is very much obviously an attempt to recoup the Enlightenment, but again, not in the sense of an uncritical affirmation of the Enlightenment as some kind of historical monolith, but a selective appropriation, an attempt to, to use the Hegelian terms, to find the truth within it, which also means distinguishing that truth from its falsity. Now, this is rationalist because it basically returns to the idea that there can be such a thing as a universal account of reason. And this is, interestingly enough, for all of those of us who are interested in continental philosophy, if you go back to the beginning of the continental tradition with Hegel and Husserl, this was the core of their projects. The idea that we could provide a universal account of the structure of thought. And subsequently in their appropriations by Heidegger, Derrida, and a variety of other theorists, this has not just been abandoned, but actively and hostilely rejected. So the core feature of this sort of new rationalism is the return to this notion. And it's a universalism insofar as not only do we attempt to find a universal structure of reason, but we wish to sort of locate and reaffirm certain classical philosophical notions within the context of this universal structure of reason. So concepts like truth, freedom, justice, beauty. I could go on. Now, what's important about this attempt to recoup these notions is that although it's in a certain sense inspired by Plato, it very much moves from Plato to Kant. And what I mean by this is two real things. One, it rejects the idea that these universals are anything like archetypes. So for Plato, the idea of justice is an archetypal state. It is a map of the way things should be. That's just a bad way of conceiving normative ideals. Secondly, these aren't meant to be conceived as metaphysical grounds. And again, in Plato, the form of the good is actually the ground of nature. These things have causal efficacy. So there's no Platonism here in the sense of either trying to say there is some metaphysical form of justice, or in the sense of saying, well, there just is a perfect just state. Rather, the idea is to try and understand justice as a task, a kind of, rather than a concrete set of cultural norms that would resemble a particular state, as something like a normative schema for thinking about and developing such norms, sort of a meta-normative schema, if you will. How am I doing for time? Anybody tell me?
Yeah, you're doing fine. Probably about 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay, I'll try and go forward. Now, the important thing about this rationalism, having said that, delineated its non-Platonism, is that again it tries to recoup the notion of rationality in such a way as to get away from what you might think of as 3 parochial rationalisms that still haunt us. So one would be colonial rationality, or the idea of rationality is commensurate with civilization. So this kind of rationality is just a shibboleth. It's just an ideological weapon used to defend certain cultural practices and project them upon others. 2, there's what you might call economic rationality, or the idea of efficiency. This is what's kind of dominant within neoliberalism, and it's what's been kind of consistently critiqued by Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School and Heidegger and various people. Right? This is a truncation of practical rationality. It takes the whole of rationality to be something which is actually only a small part of it. And third, there's what you might call deductive rationality, and this is basically a very limited conception of reason based on what you call first-order classical logic as it gets taught at first-year undergraduate level in universities, which is, people think it's this kind of, wow, now we have the tools for understanding the whole of thinking. That's actually a very, very tiny part of the modern understanding of reason coming out of mathematics and proof theory and all these other things. And this is what Reza Negrestani kind of is interested in breaking with what he calls abduction and thinking about abduction. Right. I haven't managed to say much about how accelerationism comes out of this. So if you think rationalism is an attempt to recoup the Enlightenment by recouping reason and some of these ideal universals, accelerationism is an attempt to recoup modernity in general. But maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Is that fine?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, totally. Or you're done, Pete?
If is that about 10 minutes?
More or less.
More or less. Okay.
Yes.
I mean,
I think we can. Yeah.
I just got to the end of a page of notes and just decided I should probably just open it up. You know.
That's fine. I think we'll continue on this thread actually, because the what I have to say now is actually very brief, and I think in a way
I've got
touches
a
on
short
what
definition of acceleration.
Please.
Again, like this is, you know, there's only an emerging accelerationist canon. It's not like I'm the authority on it or anything. But what I'd say is it's an attempt to disentangle the emancipatory elements of modernity from their enmeshment in capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, right, amongst other nexuses of oppression, right, focusing particularly upon those features that drove the transition from feudalism to capitalism, with the aim of intensifying and cultivating those features to produce the transition to post-capitalism, right? So it's all about this kind of selection of elements of historical modernity in order for them to be cultivated independently of their involvement within nexuses of oppression.
Thank you.
Go for it.
Yeah. So just, I think, thank you for both of your interventions. Just to go back, I think start where Anthony started and tie it together with what Pete was saying. And I also ended my opening with the question of whether, you know, the entanglement, whether the conceptual and historical entanglement between capitalism, modernity, and colonialism should and can indeed be separated conceptually. So on the one hand, we're dealing with, Anthony, you manifested that you're, you know, doubtful of whether this is even a viable project to begin with. And Pete is here obviously saying that, yes, it is a question of selectively choosing the aspects of these historical and intellectual trajectories as to both wrest the truth out of them and in a way give a novel conceptual valency to it. I think what I'm missing, and interestingly, I think this is in a way what's missing in both interventions, and where maybe we can go to this point, is the question of how actually, whether you depart from any of this, any of these two positions, you can still, in a way, be saying you're affirming, in a way, or rejecting the paternalism or the ways in which representation works in a process of mediation, of speaking for someone else, and that, in a way, kind of rejects the ways in which something akin to an epistemology that comes from after the colonial period is then possible. What I'm missing here is then the question of how do you actually would then formulate in both of these views, because Anthony's, yours is, in a way, what I see is a bit of a negative formulation, because I see the call for example, considering the history of, yes, the Middle Passage, absolutely, the question of slavery, definitely, but there's also an extent to which, at least if you look at the intellectual history of a place like Latin America, and that's the example I can give, one of the things that you see is that intellectual thinkers after the process of emancipation have themselves done a lot to articulate the extent to which they were wrestling with being, on the one hand, having an intellectual heritage that was very much seen as being European, and at the same time having to extricate themselves from that in order to precisely reinstate something that would be called an emancipated post-colonial identity or post-colonial position in that sense. So what does it mean then to go through the process of independence from the colony? And how can you actually then formulate that positively? That's something that I'm interested in, because one thing is to say that, one thing is to phrase that negatively, and the other thing is to phrase that positively, yet the project, in a way, still remains up in the air. So maybe if you can both say a bit about that, I think. Because what I'm concerned here is how do you actually then don't simply like look at post-colonial as a theory or as just as a series of articulations that have happened, in a lot of it in American academia, which is also very much problematic if you look at the multiculturalist tendency this has, and it has, especially in terms of how it's very easy to say, well, I've done my research, I've studied it, but in terms of how, what does that actually entail in practical terms today, I would say. So if maybe you can say a bit about that, so going back to Anthony and then going back to Pete.
So there's a lot there to try to respond to. Let me just focus on the question of negativity versus positivity or positive project. I'm not sure that the task is to create a positive project, at least not where I'm sitting. I mean, this kind of question of how do you deal with the past? How does the post-colonial subject, the subaltern who uses Enlightenment tools, how do they fit into this kind of debate? Or the question, because I do think we have to make sure that everyone understands there's a distinction here between the subaltern and the slave. How does the slave, who's completely cut off from any kind of quote-unquote indigenous culture, and who only has, in a certain sense, the Western tradition in which to engage with, except for certain traces or remnants that become very different in the on the slave plantation. I don't think that the problem is one of searching for some kind of purity, where now we have like the authentic self, and so like they're free of the West. It's not some fear of the West in any kind of simplistic sense, but it's rather what I'm trying to say is that if you want to disentangle modernity, Enlightenment from patriarchy, racism, and all these other things, then you have to make your primary locus that question of what is most worldless in that world. You have to make your primary locus not the question of how fucking cool machines are, but how there are still people who are completely and utterly kept out of the world and used as part of running that system. Like you just said, the kind of problematic way this gets represented in academia is something I could be said to be performing right now. Like, oh, here's our like black product, and I put it in play. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that actually looking at that antagonism has to be the way forward. That any kind of positive project has to begin with a radical negativity about the future.
I mean, I'm gonna kind of disagree with that, obviously.
No.
Who would have thought? But I mean, I just think that you have to start somewhere. We start in the present, and yes, part of that present is the continued existence of the institution of slavery, and a whole variety of other forms of oppression that we need to struggle against. The universalist case for universalism, and this is the thing, the case for it is going to be from a universal perspective, right, is that in order to integrate these different dimensions of struggle, you need to have a universal conception of freedom with which to understand how these things are all forms of oppression and what it would be to emancipate yourself from them. And there are various additional reasons you could bring up for this. I mean, one of the things I'll say is, I know that the concept of suffering is very important to Anthony, but the question of suffering, the concept of suffering, from my perspective, just isn't sufficient. And one of the best ways of showing this is to say that you can be oppressed without suffering, right? This is one of the big things of patriarchy and feminism, is that, you know what, women have in many cases within the 20th century been in very pleasant forms of oppression, in which, you know, the white picket fence, it's all very nice. I'm not saying that there's no suffering there at all, but I'm saying the sheer absence of suffering, the attempt to achieve contentment and pleasantness, does not erase it. Mm-hmm. And the only way you can understand that difference is on the basis of a positive conception of freedom and how it's being constrained. I mean,
can I stop here, Pete?
Yeah, go for it.
Real quick. Yeah, but this is precisely, I think, one of the things that you can see that, just to give another example of how this tension between, in a way, a focus on an account of previous experiences and the past, so to speak, as a way of affirming the impossibility to disentangle coloniality, modernity, and capitalism, versus the tendency to say, no, let's intensify the places where that separation or that disentanglement is actually possible, in order to precisely create a space in which, for example, in the context of Latin America, you don't simply look at 19th century thinkers who are writing right after the movement of independence, for example, as carrying on the further, the legacy, carrying on the legacy of the colonial criollo classes. So in Latin American context, the way in which this is taking place is through the question of decolonization and post-hegemony, which are right now, so to speak, the two main threads running. On the one hand, the decolonial forerunners are saying, well, to be honest, we haven't actually exited colonialism. These structures that were made possible in the 16th century through this kind of commercial capitalism that arrived in South America are, their legacies are still in place, and a decolonial option would then mean evacuating all of that content, but at the same time they're affirming that history. They haven't actually changed that history. On the other hand, you have the post-hegemony thinkers, such as John Beasley Murray, who would say that, no, actually capitalism has changed a lot. There are still structures of hegemony and of oppression. They are different, though. So the concepts and the mechanisms that one would use to try, in a way, to solve that problem are no longer applicable, because we're looking at a different world. So
I think that's a really important point, which is that the attempt to view like structures of oppression as monoliths, as like these kind of like phenomena that can't be kind of broken down a little bit, also prevents you from understanding how they change. It prevents you from understanding how capitalism in the present is quite different from 19th century capitalism. And the same with the other structures of oppression we're talking about. In order to actually engage and struggle with them, you need to be able to analyze. And I think this is sort of the irony of what I'd call the genealogical case against universalism.
And on the other hand, Anthony, sorry, Pete, keep going.
No, I was going to say, I think that if you say that there's a sort of genealogical case against universalism, I think there's sort of two sort of real ironies of this case. Here's a sort of like genealogical case against anti-universalism. One is that it tends to present universalism as a monolithic abstraction. Like, rather than enabling universalism to be a plural thing in which you have a plurality of universalisms and potentially non-Western universalisms as well, it gets presented as a monolithic enemy. And the consequence of this is there's a tendency to treat anti-universalism as the spontaneous philosophy of the oppressed. And that's just, that's a very convenient move, because it always puts you on the side of the underdog, but it's just false. It prevents the oppressed from becoming an interlocutor in the way that I think Deneb's been recommending.
On the other hand, I think what Anthony, drawing attention to the question of the machines, for example, which I know it's something that has come up in previous debates, or the question of course, industrialized capitalism, which in a way I would see, Anthony, what you're saying is in a way, akin to what a lot of post-hegemonist Latin American thinkers think, in the sense that, yeah, the new modes of colonization, so to speak, could be seen as being, outsourcing resources to the third world, exploiting that labor in a different way. I mean, cheap wages, go to Brazil and Argentina, it's great for raising beef, and there's plenty of water for soya. Go to China for some other things, etc. So the question then of, I think, in a way, to what extent is it that the autonomy you give to the concepts that Pete was, on the other hand, trying to bring to the fore as needing reconceptualization, such as reason, truth, beauty, etc. I see that in a way. I see that you're concerned with that, and I don't know, maybe you can say a bit more about that, or if you see anything of value in this two examples I've given, or just your thoughts on that.
I mean, this is going to go out into the ether, and I don't want to be on record as saying I hate beauty or something, but
oh, you can. You can.
Yeah. No. I mean, that's actually been one of my kind of persistent annoyances with a lot of the accelerationist discourses. It's built on a kind of ugliness, like people arguing against certain things in localism that, okay, we want to talk about not patronizing the subaltern or whatever, but you see Mark Fisher back in the day talking about how poor people shouldn't be forced to feel guilty for not buying organic eggs or like whatever. And I mean, I agree with the thrust of that, but it's also built off. It's like just so short-sighted, because it's like, well, why should the poor eat shit? Why not also look at the various ways in which, rather than just looking at Euro-radicalism, why don't you actually engage with some of the radical trends coming out of certain black groups, which are like, sorry, they look like folk politics. Are they just do they not get to play in this discourse because they're not talking about the same universal things? I mean, okay, granted they're not archetypes, but how do you deploy these commonplaces from European philosophy in ways that don't just fall back into the same sort of practices that they came out of in their original formulation, without going under this radical critique? So, I love beauty, but why not beauty under this critique, rather than making beauty what everything else has to subject itself to?
So just, I think one of the things that I'm seeing here is the question of like what, the manifesto affirms this, and the question of like a alien future, which is also the overarching scope of this debate, fixing the future. And you said, why not encounter, or why not look for the truly alien in that sense?
Can I answer that question?
Yes.
Because it's ethereal. Like the idea of complete and utter radical otherness, radical alienness, is just a way of shutting down actual practical engagement. I mean, it's in the sense of I actually wrote this down somewhere. It basically amounts to negative theology or political eschatology. Like we can't think what the future is like, but if you can't think what the future is like, you can't plan to achieve it in any way, shape, or form. Not even in the sense of, well, maybe 1,000 years from now, my actions will have an effect upon the realization of something which I don't quite understand, but I've got a rough idea of where it's going. You throw out all practical. I mean, this is the thing: is if you want to understand what the difference is between a desire and a wish, right? A desire is something which has a relation to practical action. A wish is a desire with all of that relation taken away. So the turn to the alien future is asking us to wish for a better future, not to desire one.
Well, I would just like to point out that that's from the Manifesto. I'm pushing on this point in the Manifesto where it says we have to have an alien future, a post-capitalist future.
Yeah, but not a
I'm fine.
One that's
Sorry, Anthony?
recognizable.
What's that?
I said it's not a radically alien one. It's one that's recognizable. It's yes, we want an alien future, but that's not to say we want a future we can't comprehend.
Okay, I mean, well then why use the term alien? Like, is this just a mark of rhetoric? Like what? You know, like this is what I mean by the difficulty of engaging with this stuff, because it's like, well, when we say that, we don't mean this. When we say freedom, you know, like that sounds good. But when we say enlightenment, we don't mean all the stuff that obviously gets that freedom at the
when we use words, we do not use every possible connotation of the word that you could pick. I mean, that's just how language works. I mean, the whole assumption of discursive charity is that, you know what, there's something determinate these people mean when they use X, Y, or Z theoretical term with a wide, complex, and far-ranging history. Maybe they're picking certain particular senses and trying to narrow those down. I mean, just to go back to alien, why would one think that when we call for an alien future, or when rather Alex and Nick call for an alien future, that it means radical otherness, it means complete incomprehensibility? I mean, I don't see how it's charitable to assume that. It's not.
Mm-hmm. I just to say something just around this, I think one of the things that, I mean, you don't actually have to radicalize the term alien for it to be applicable. I mean, I think in a way the case of like global expansion in the 16th century, what that makes clear as a historical example, as a historical reality, is the way indeed in which the New World was such an incredibly uprooting encounter for the West in terms of, like, for example, if you look at like Spaniards arriving in New Spain and having to deal with the question of what do you do with these territories? Do they belong to us because a Christian God created these territories and these are not legal subjects per se? Do we extend legal subjectivity into the Aztecs so that then they belong to the same kingdom, yes or no? So all of these questions, I mean, this is just an example of how it was still an encounter. It was definitely an encounter with something alien. I don't think there is indeed nothing of like negative theology here, but precisely the question of what is it, to what extent not that we have that nowadays or not, and what are the mechanisms and the places in which these kinds of encounters are still possible. I'm not saying obviously with the structure of power and exploitation of 16th century, you know, Spanish colonization in New Spain, but I'm specifically trying to bring attention here, I think, to the question of there is still an extent to which, whether you affirm a project of reconceiving universality and reason, or whether you say indeed that, for example, dialogue with Black intellectuals, with Latin American intellectuals, and with that political reality can occur. I think this is maybe a good place to end before we move to the questions, is what does it mean then? What kinds of possible encounters, what are the possible encounters we have, and what would that mean actually to our own thought in that sense, or to a paradigm that we are assuming? Because that means that you also have to open yourself, you also have to make the position you're coming from in a way kind of liable to something alien insofar it's not endogenous to your own perspective. So, I mean, this is a basic structure in a way that I'm trying to just outline, but I think we could probably answer that, and I'm sure there are a bunch of questions coming in that we can then bring up and move towards. So I don't know if any of you want to say something about this. That would be great to move towards the conclusion.
Yeah, so I guess I should thank Peter for the lesson and how language works. I do want to point out that in the Manifesto, it does say properly alien future, which suggests a kind of intensification of what that term means. And I will also say that what you then went on to say was exactly the point I said in my opening remarks, was that this is an alien future that's the recovery of a European future. So the question of how do we then
Towards the conclusion.
how do we
Sorry?
then
Mhm.
how do we then think of what something alien would be? Well, alien's probably the wrong word. I do think something more like diasporic is probably better here, and that's what I was trying to get at in terms of engaging with actually existing folk movements from groups who are resisting, who are very much counter to this world. So that's my answer.
Do I have time, or?
Yes, absolutely.
One thing I'd just like to say is, I mean, Nick and Alex have been working on this book on folk politics for years now, and they've been working on it since before the Manifesto came out. So the term folk politics, there's a lot more research and intellectual weight behind that than it might otherwise seem. I'm not an expert on this, but they have studied quite in depth actually existing political movements, and there's going to be a more interesting debate about that. There's going to be a more interesting debate about the actually existing political movements and the extent to which they have negative folk elements and positive elements, right? As for the question of alienness and being, well, okay, it's all about being put outside of our comfort zones, right? Mm-hmm. Both in the sense of being shoved into a future in which things are going to change, and they're going to change in unexpected ways, and we're going to have to, in some sense, be prepared for the unexpected, right? Be ready for the future to come and hit us. And on the other hand, in following Deneb, to be put outside of our discursive comfort zone, to be willing to make interlocutors who are outside of our the traditional scope of our discourses, right? We've got to be willing to let people into the discussion, and that's fine. But the way to let them into the discussion isn't by kind of positing a kind of a radical discomfort.
Why is it a matter of letting them in, though? They're already in.
Well, if they are, then it's fine. But I mean,
my point is that.
Yes, Anthony, you go ahead. We have time still.
I mean, I just don't understand this kind of language. Like, you mean that whoever we're talking about aren't coming to Berlin, or that they're not part of a discourse about how the future should look? Because they're clearly already part of the discourse. Just if no one's listening to them, that's incumbent upon those who don't listen.
Okay, then we should listen to them. If you want to replace letting them in with listening, the point is, and I think this is what Deneb said at the beginning, which is to actually have to let the colonized and the oppressed otherwise be interlocutors, rather than to speak for them. And I think that's we all should basically agree on that. The question is, what are the enabling conditions of that, and that's where we probably disagree.
When I said that also, it was Anthony, to reply to this and in a way to take this a bit further. I'm also getting a couple of questions here. The question is, in a way, for example, if you look at a lot of the nascent theories of race and critiques of colonialism that emerged after, so to speak, Said. And Said is just an example because there were people in Brazil already doing a critique of colonialism way before he was even publishing in English. But of course, this has to do also an important question, the question of, like intellectual scenes and intellectual debate that, the discourse of Anglo-American academia is, in a way, the one that makes itself more visible, right? And there's an extent to which we kind of follow that trajectory, while, in fact, obviously, there are things that are inaccessible unless, you speak another language or translate. That's another thing that happens a lot. I think yes, there are people that are already included. I think that looking at the conditions of enablement is important, just in the sense that I think if you look at the atmosphere of the 80s and 90s, at least in cultural studies, and the tendency towards having a sort of like multicultural world in a way, the conditions under which a lot of the studies were carried out were such that merely bringing that content in already seemed to do the job. And I'm not saying you're affirming that, obviously. I'm just bringing attention to that in a way, because I think there is something more about emphasizing the conditions of enunciation, or the conditions in which like epistemic agency is taken seriously, that can be more productive in precisely bringing more difference in. So I guess, you know, for all the talk that we have been having, I mean, and I think a lot of this has to do precisely with like, well, proliferation of difference, for example, which is why I also use the term proliferation of logocentrisms, just in the sense that it seems like there are a lot of perspectives out there, and it seems like now we have a sort of like panoramic like view on like all the voices that are there, yet the discursive conditions that they've adopted for themselves are often ones that are pretty easy for us to deal with, if you know what I mean. So the question is, for example, unlike the United States or Canada, would maybe to an extent, like indigenous people in the Amazon, so to speak, have never been studied besides as anthropological or ethnological objects of study. And there's no such thing as native studies in the same way that you have in the United States, in Brazil. And I would say that that's maybe a fortunate thing in some ways, just in the sense that now that debate all of a sudden becomes possible, in the sense of what does it mean to actually not study them as objects, but precisely be affected by their mode of thinking, so to speak, which is an entirely different way of engaging. So I guess maybe this is something that we can think of. Let me just ask Mo, how are we doing on time, if we should already take questions.
There was a question posted to us that I passed on to you.
Here, I'll start with that question then.
Start with that, and then I have a question after that. So
okay.
I will like try to like ask a question.
Okay. So one of the questions that emerged here, I'm just gonna try to read it, and I think it might be for you, Anthony, to elaborate a bit more, which has to do with the way in which, for example, black folk political movements, with otherness and with the alien, and the way in which you're equating that. Maybe you can just elaborate that once more. The question was phrased in a different way. It was like,
well, why don't you just read the question? It's okay.
Hey, I have a question. I'm not trying to be a dick. I know that Anthony Paul Smith equates black folk political movements, which I agree with what he's trying to say, but I don't think he's saying it right, with the alien other.
Okay.
That's the question.
Who's that from?
That is coming from Zach Davis.
Oh, okay. Hey, Zach. No, I think you're right that I'm not saying it right. That's why I did try to correct it later on in the discussion. I think it's better to think of these in terms of a kind of diasporic element rather than an alien element. That does change it quite a bit. I do want to emphasize, though, that the alien character of Africa was a huge part of well, the kind of casting of Africa as alien, not its actual, but its casting as being alien, was a huge part of the kind of problematic that sets up that possibility for primitive accumulation. So.
And
so so I'm gonna ask a question. Mike, can you hear me? Of course you can. Okay. So my question tries to sort of like go back to what was stated in the summer school statement minus the wrong choice of word. And I think that can also be helpful maybe to sort of like bring these two conversations close together, which is sort of like, so even if we take the word colonize out of that sentence, there is a reality in the academic world. I can speak of North America, but also to some extent I've heard about Germany and other places in Europe in which, so like certain strands of post-structuralism, Frankfurt School, dominate, like we don't want to use the word colonize, that word's out, dominate the institutions of learning as the official ideology. And there's also, I think personally, this is my opinion, that there's a tacit agreement between Frankfurt Schoolers and post-structuralists to not infight. So they've carved out territories and languages in which both of them are comfortable using. So really, that was the problem that I thought the statement was trying to deal with, perhaps with wrong wording, and we still deal with that. That, like, in fact, what should be let in is not the black subject. It's does this sort of like conglomerate, this mafia of critical theory, will open up for accelerationism and rationalism to join the table, because I think that should really be the question. How would that happen? Through like a granting of tenure position to universal, like, I don't know, adopting some of this material into course readings? How would then, especially given how combative rationalism is towards these schools of thought that have dominated post-World War II almost increasingly, how would that take place? How would this open up take place?
Pete, you want to start maybe?
Well, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of what the kind of polemical tone of the summer school was aimed at. There is a kind of perennial anti-universalism that comes down from basically post-World War II. I mean, it's mainly within the sort of continental philosophical tradition and the various discourses that are downstream from that. You could call it critical theory if you want to, or just the prefix critical on top of whatever you want to add. But I think what's fascinating about these discourses is that much in the way that, and I don't want to kind of bring back my misuse of colonialism here, but much in the way that rationality and reason was used as a shibboleth by colonialism, to sort of like indicate a kind of in-group understanding which is implicit of what constitutes proper cultural norms. There are these kind of theoretical shibboleths in the academy. So personally, I would pick matter, structure, and practice as being three perfect ones, where, you know, these originally come from discourses like Marxism or structuralism coming out of Saussure and whatnot, and practice, which to do with like Nietzsche and Heidegger and you know, the American pragmatists, and they've become warped in such a way that they're used to indicate certain perennial critiques. So they keep the critical structure, which is like, okay, well, we're going to get rid of your reified metaphysical conception of subjects or whatever, because really these are just deeper structures, while at the same time jettisoning any ability to actually understand those detailed structures. So the actual details of material constitution, linguistic and other structural systems, and actual pragmatics of things like genuine discourse are just kind of abandoned. And part of what I'm trying to do with this summer school is to say, well, look, how do we take apart these shibboleths? How do we deconstruct them and let ourselves back in? Which fundamentally means letting back in the detailed analysis of things like matter, practice, and structure.
Paul, would you like to respond to that too? I really would like, because, you know, you're like an anomaly, because you're not a post-structuralist, nor you're identified with Frankfurt School. You sort of like, you have your own philosophical concerns, and somehow you are in one of those positions. Like, so it's not like impossible to penetrate academia, but you see what I'm trying to get at here, I hope.
Yeah. I mean, I think this kind of portrayal of what academia is like is a little strawmannish. You know, I'm subject to metrics all day long, Everyone's always talking about student learning outcomes and how are we going to measure them. There's a constant attack on the humanities, which I guess is this sort of this kind of common sense that you guys just portrayed. But that's I mean, at Harvard, I guess they're safe, but at schools, smaller schools, they're very much threatened, and people are told not to study them. They're told to go into business, which, again, metrics, ratios. They're told to go into STEM subjects. There's ever-increasing attempts to try and get rid of the requirements in the liberal studies core. I know in England it's a little different because you don't have a liberal arts education, a tradition of that. But in the U.S., where you have to take many different courses in addition to your major, they're trying to get rid of the kind of courses where you would even talk about this sort of stuff. There is some kind of lip service to multiculturalism, but I'm not concerned with that. But I'm also not really concerned. I mean, I see on Facebook, and a lot of times the accelerationists are like, look how much attention we're getting outside the academy, and that's held up as a mark of, or a badge, of something to be proud of. I think that's fine, but like, why do you want in the academy if it's so moribund and?
I believe in the academic ideal. I just think that ideal prescribes more to us than solidarity in the face of losing our jobs. Like, the academic ideal involves some kind of willingness to critique each other's positions and take responsibility for our positions. And the stuff that I'm kind of criticizing is precisely a kind of endemic avoidance of responsibility, an endemic avoidance of actually backing up the perennial critiques you stand for with detailed analysis. And I think that, if you want me to put it in, what I'd say is that's an abdication of academic responsibility, and I can't simply sort of overlook that because of solidarity with the academia as it exists, because quite frankly we all know that academia as it exists is going to change. I'm not going to kind of go on a para-academic rant about how para-academia is everything. It's not, right? I'm an academic. I want to be in the academy, but I know the academy is going to change, and I'm not going to stop critiquing other academics in order to kind of have some kind of solidarity with the way things are, because they aren't perfect.
Well, I don't think you should stop critiquing them. I think if the implication, though, is that anyone working in post-colonial theory or Afro-pessimism or any of these things doesn't back up their claims with analysis, I mean, that's, I think, patently false.
Again, it's. I'm not saying that. Again, like, this isn't a blanket claim about, like, the whole point of the summer school is to actually have a discourse about this stuff. So, like, to try and actually have a discourse of post-colonial theory, not simply to dismiss it outright. That's the whole point of the idea of.
Can I throw a question for you guys? Just a question in a way relating to this a bit. How do you see because one of the an initial argument that has been made, for example, I mean, by someone like Spivak, who is the person that everyone chooses to go to think of. I mean, it's the first person that comes to mind when thinking of like post-colonial theory, which is itself another whole problematic thing and something that I would also, would like to continue discussing in another instance. But one of the things that she, in a way, makes clear is, for example, the question of monolingualism and the question of English, the way in which all of these debates, I mean, take place in English. Just to throw it out there in a way, like, would you see this having would you see linguistic competence or learning other languages as having any import on this? Like, because I have heard actually people saying that, English, for being such a globalizing language in a way, and for being also a language that is very much used, for example, like Dutch, and if you trace that back to like to 16th century, in the context of commercial exchange, obviously. So it facilitates that kind of exchange very well, but maybe not others. So there are people that say, no, that's not a problem at all in academia. But what do you think about that?
I mean, Anthony's a translator here, so he has more authority on this topic than I do. I have something to say, but
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think anyone can. I think it's a question for everyone.
My inability to fluently speak other languages is a constant source of embarrassment and frustration. And I think, I mean, the parallel I think for English is Latin, which was the kind of the lingua franca of academia in its inception. And I think there's no reason it needs to remain English, or that we can't develop a better system of kind of translation and intersection of different languages. I should probably do my bit to it, but at the moment I'm a bit kind of hamstrung on that front. I mean, I think particularly in continental philosophy, which is something I know something about, the language barrier has produced certain kind of weird pathology. So you get certain kind of bad translations producing whole industries of kind of weird sort of francophile stuff that isn't quite either the English philosophy or the French philosophy. And so, just as a discourse or an institution being better set up to have multilingual discourse, we would benefit.
And English obviously is itself a very flexible language. I mean, there's no way that, like English is spoken in so many different places. Obviously, like now what you see is that there are other languages that are also being, like Spanish, for example, is, needless to say, very important. Anthony, do you want to say anything on that? Because I just got a question.
I mean, no, just to say that I agree with Pete that, the monolinguism that we're subject to is embarrassing, and I think for both of us, it's the result of class issues. I live in a predominantly English-speaking country where everyone has to speak American, and I didn't get to in my very class. Very, very poor background. We just didn't get to engage in that. But it's a problem for sure. But that's all.
One last question that I just got here. I'm gonna read it, and then I think we can close after you both answer this question, which is so the contention with which Deneb opened, that the impetus driving the critique is logocentric, plus that this logocentrism is arguably shared by both parties in the debate, underlines the fact that the dispute is actually not over universalism, but simply over the correct ways to talk about it. So, so maybe
I think
I'd
like to agree there on that front.
Well, I mean, I do think that there are issues of I mean, we're both speaking English, but we're coming at this with really different commitments, and so I do think even speaking together, there's bits where we may be missing each other's meanings. I mean, I know I felt that a few times. For me, though, I don't think that what I'm saying is subject to a kind of logocentrism, because my whole point is that it has to be the world created by this logos, and I mean world in a kind of abstract sense, not like the Earth, the physical planet, but the world is very much constructed by something that is worldless. Like that's its condition for possibility, and what I'm trying to say is we have to rethink our entire discourse on the basis of that, not so much talk like me, I don't think.
All I've got to say is I'm team logocentrism. I'm an affirmed logocentrist. Not because.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, not because I think logocentrism is what people think it is, which is fallow logocentrism, this kind of like
Absolutely not. Yeah. I hope it was clear that when I used that term, it wasn't like that.
But this is like the way logocentrism is portrayed is as if every bad binary opposition there could possibly be, male, female, mind, body, anything you want to name, are all kind of like intersected and fundamentally structured in rational discourse. I just think that's crap. Not to say that these things don't have historic associations. It's just that, again, it's not a monolithic structure. And if you actually try and peel away the structure of the logos reason from it, you find it's far more abstract and interesting.
I think the way that I proposed it in the beginning was very much about the protocols for accessing truth and for generating it. So it was not at all in the sense of the question of binaries, but precisely the ways in which the criteria and the protocols and the parameters that different modalities of contemporary theory are giving themselves access to certain philosophical propositions or not others, for example, and then also through that creating, for example, what constitutes a legitimate position to have a locus of determination where something is definitely this and not that, so to speak. It was meant very much in this sense, actually. So I think Mo, are we?
Yeah, I just wanted to our partner in crime as part of Facing the Future, Joshua Johnson, just posted something. I'm just going to quickly read that and give Anthony or Paul maybe a couple of minutes to respond to that. Joshua wrote, I think universalism requires some criteria for its mediation or representation. So the question of logocentrism would be one about the
Mo disappeared.
It's a vanishing mediator.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll come back on if you guys want to just continue.
We have to discuss.
Let's.
I can read it. So the thing is, Josh is saying, I think universalism requires criteria for its mediation or representation. So the question of logocentrism would be one about the proper criteria of that representation. I would say the difference is that Anthony denies that there can be such criteria in the positive sense. That's where it stops. That's how we got the intervention.
Let's see here. Such criteria. I mean, I like the police siren going off in the background, actually. I think I want that to be my response, if that's okay. I know that's oblique, but yeah.
Appropriate, I think.
Yep.
Okay, so I guess, Deneb, you have anything to add?
No, I was gonna make a joke about Pete's epistemology police T-shirt.
Oh, I didn't mean that.
That police siren. No, not really. I don't have anything. I think we've covered most of the points. Of course, we can continue.
I suppose I have one thing I could add, just because I haven't used the word navigation once in this whole thing, and that's what the topic of the summer school is. And I just thought I'd say, like, the whole sort of impetus of this navigational idea, which sort of comes from Salemy, and Deneb actually knows more about than I do, as does Reza. I'm only just kind of dipping my toes into Salemy. It seems to be precisely about trying to think about how we can, I think he uses the category theoretical term gluing, how we can kind of glue different discourses together to produce kind of like broader spaces. So how we can kind of form bridges between different, logoi, different kinds of discourse, in such a way that we can then sort of see the general structures that underlie. We can work towards some kind of universal by kind of moving outside of our local area into more global spaces.
Yeah, I think Salemy and in his theory of the way he reads Latin American thought, like 19th century and early, like 20th century Latin American thought, is very much about the condition of Latin America as frontier, and not necessarily like, not only like, it's not even like in terms of otherness, but precisely how it does it. It's how it does this gluing. So it's not even a question of like, for example, whether they're, you know, if the intellectual classes or groups of intellectuals are simply adopting European or Western ideas, but what it is that they are doing with it. And to say what they're doing with it, you do to an extent need to take that episteme seriously, whether it comes from, you know, regardless of whether it comes from that background of colonialism or not. Because without that, precisely, you end up with a history in which everything is a product of a history that we're already assuming in that sense. But thanks for bringing that up, Pete.
I'm looking forward to hearing your.
Yeah, thank you. Mo?
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap it up by saying that it will be exciting to follow up with what you guys are gonna talk about in the summer school and really evaluate it not only based on the statement, but by the actual performance of seminar leaders and seminars that will happen. And I'm sure a lot of people will be eagerly watching to see what comes out of the Berlin Summer School. Also look forward to what we are going to be doing all summer long with my friends and colleagues, Sohail Malik, Joshua Johnson, and Keith Tilford, in terms of Fixing the Future platform in New York. We're going to be doing a series of seminars and leading up to some exhibitions and a conference.
He's gone again.
Uh-oh. Okay.
We have a backup, I guess.
Yeah.
Not that Moore's having the technical
Or
difficulties.
Josh or Suhail wanna, or we can wait for him to get back again.
There seems to be third time the charm for me. This is my third time trying out Google Hangouts, and first time I haven't been cut off, so I'm quite pleased.
Mo or Jason? Where's Jason?
Yeah,
There
here
we
you
go.
Yeah, so I'm back again. So that's it. We wrap it up, and thanks again everyone for participating. Thank you, Anthony Paul, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, Deneb, for your moderation of the debate.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. Catch you guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.